Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Committee of the Whole for Tuesday, March 5th. Hassan Swalwin, please Tillicumik, Black Squamish, Owaimeo. We are meeting today on the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. Motion to adopt the agenda. Moved by Councillor French, seconded by Councillor Pettengill. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. So, a short agenda today, which is always welcome, but we're going back to an item we had from last week, the Land Development Procedures Bylaw, and we didn't have enough time to sort of have a fulsome conversation on this topic, so I've asked Sarah to come back and give us a chance to ask more questions and talk about this more thoroughly. So I'll hand it back to you, Mr. Chad.
Thanks so much. Hello, Council. Sarah McDonald, Community Planning. Thanks for allowing a little bit of extra time to review and discuss the Procedures Bylaw update. So again, we're bringing forward this updated bylaw. It's necessary to align our development procedures with and fees with a new official community plan that we adopted in 2015. So I'm just very quickly going to recap the substantive proposed amendments for Council's understanding, and then we'll go right back into the discussion around host further discussion around the permit delegations and open it up so we can answer any additional questions that Council might have. So in terms of the major updates that are contained within Bylaw 2632, you will recall we've integrated development approval information area requirements. We've also adjusted some of the procedures around land use contract amendment applications. And then we've also expanded or aligned the procedures bylaw with the newly designated development permit areas, particularly for environmental development permits, DPA 1, as well as development permits for works within flood hazard areas, DPA 2. And then we've adjusted some of the temporary use permit delegation exemptions. We've added liquor and cannabis license referrals and recommendations as an item for delegation to staff. And I won't go through these in further detail at this time, but can answer any questions that you have. I'm going to skip over this slide that just highlights the different development approval information areas.
Yeah. Did you want to wait till the end, or do you have a question or clarification?
It was just on one of those. I can wait to the end if you want, but I was just going to ask about one of them.
Previous slide?
I'm sorry, yeah.
I was just curious about the land use contract amendments. What is the process for that? Is that district initiated up, landowner initiated? Is it like just a simple rezoning?
Yeah, through the chair. Typically, the land use contract amendments, those are applicant-led. So if there's a rezoning or such that come forward, the district would then address the land use contract and move through a move to early termination. They are a form of contract zoning that is all of the land use contracts in the province will cease to exist by 2024. So the Local Government Act has provided guidance to local governments to ensure that there's zoning adopted in their place in advance of the termination of those land use contracts. So at this time, the district hasn't been going out to actively rezone. We've been waiting for applications to come in and addressing them on a project-by-project basis.
But at some point, and I know we went through last term with the seniors, for example, that involved rezoning, and so in the course of that, the land use contract was terminated. But if a property owner did nothing, what would happen? Would it just lapse and be essentially unzoned property, or are we at some point going to start initiating rezoning?
If I may, through you, Chair, we are planning to include the zoning properties that have a land use contract in the zoning bylaw update. Those contracts are probably going to continue remaining on property. We just want to make sure that there's something when 2024 hits, that there's something in place underneath those contracts. So those contracts, unless we repeal them, would still remain in place, but I believe that we can have zoning on those properties as well.
I didn't get to show this slide last week, but just wanted to highlight for council in terms of the liquor and cannabis licensing recommendations. These are covered in section 17 of the procedures bylaw. And so, as you know, local governments play a role in the licensing process for liquor and cannabis retail. So we've added procedures in the bylaw, in our procedures bylaw, and are proposing to delegated authority for the director to provide referral comments and recommendations as part of the provincial licensing and regulations process. So what local governments, what happens is that once a licensee's application is received by the liquor control and retail branch, it must go to local government. We are able to provide comments and a recommendation. We typically provide confirmation of the zoning, our local government zoning for cannabis retail, any business license terms, and any views of residents that are collected through notification of properties within 100 meters. And so under procedures bylaw 2632, there is a delegation to staff to provide those comments to the provincial, through the provincial licensing. I don't know if you process or.
I just got a question from Councillor Riggs.
So, if I understand the process correctly, at some point in the provincial licensing, they have to have evidence of municipal approval. And with one of them, we did it by way of a variance, which more or less confirmed our leaning towards that. But is that still going to happen? Will it still come to council for that approval, or is that what this is?
Through the chair, so in terms of the any variance that's approved by the local government, we would highlight any variance through the provincial licensing. But if the application meets the zoning, if the use meets the zoning, we would be providing documentation to that effect through the notification.
So to add to that, it wouldn't come to council like the last one did. That would be staff delegated to respond to the problems, basically confirming that it meets zoning, business licensing requirements.
And further to that, it's mirroring what's already existing as a delegated authority for liquor. So currently, Mr. Galaniskas has the authority to provide comment under the existing bylaw around the liquor establishments or any expansions of their licensing, events, variances, and as long as it's zoned. And it's proposed that we do the same with the cannabis. So if it meets the criteria that council's already established, then it just goes to him for comment.
Councillor Riggs?
And now I can't remember whether you brought this up the last time or not, but in the variance application we had with respect to the school buffer zone, I think there were comments made, this was last term, to the effect that we might want to review those buffers, period. That's not part of this zoning, these amendments? So the buffer zones are still there, so they would be a variance if one was encroaching on it.
Yes, this is just the procedures bylaw,
Okay.
and the zoning bylaw is separate.
Different things. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so over to permit delegation. So as we talked about last week, bylaw 2632 proposes a number of permit delegations. So this is for development permits. And so I've amended this slide, hopefully to be a little bit more clear for council based on some of the questions that were raised. So on the top, you can see DPA 1 and DPA 2. These are technical development permit areas and guidelines. So what the procedures bylaw proposes is that for standalone technical development permits, so this would be for works or activities that require a permit under environmental protection or flood protection, and where no variances are proposed, these permits, these standalone permits would be delegated to staff. However, where those are combined with form and character development permit area requirements, so as you will recall from our Planning 101, for any multi-unit residential, commercial, or industrial uses, a local government can define development permit areas for form and character. And so we've done that for multi-unit, commercial, and industrial uses. So for major form and character development permits, all of those permits would be remaining with council. Where there are also development permit area 1 or 2 guidelines, those would be included and integrated within the review with those form and character development permit areas. So those would be coming before council for approval. The only form and character development permits that are being proposed to be delegated to staff are on the right-hand side in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. So we are proposing that amendments to existing development permits, form and character permits, where there's no substantial alteration that's to the form and character from what is in the existing permit, that those permits would come before would be delegated to staff, and then further minor works in the form and character development permit areas. So additions, accessory buildings or structures, any kind of alteration to facades, so materials, windows, doors, repainting, placement of exterior equipment, landscape, signage, lighting, or parks, cafes, patios, community gardens, public art installations. I just wanted to clarify, it's not the public art itself. There's a process through the Public Art Committee to review public art proposals and projects. It would just be the development permit that authorizes the placement and the siting of the public art installation that would be covered as a minor work.
Can I just ask, on the accessory buildings or structures, can you give me an example of what might happen post-DP approval that requires a minor change to an accessory building or structure?
Yeah, a common example would be expansion of a waste or recycling structure to better accommodate the required space to allow for that use. It might be an accessory building for storage, exterior storage, something like that.
But the siting would be decided by council in the form and character DP, potentially? I'm just thinking of where some siting of accessory buildings have caused some neighborhood conflict. And I'm just wanting to make sure that council is at least, so if I see that in a form and character DP that there's going to be a garbage or storage outlet situated here, and I think, okay, that makes sense. And then in the course of seeing that DP through the building permits, they say, oh, actually we need it to be, 400 square feet larger, but we're going to leave it in the same place. That seems like a delegated authority, but that makes sense. But if they're like, oh, we didn't think, now we want bicycle storage and it's this big and we're going to stick it in this corner, you're also contemplating like a new building to be a delegated authority.
Correct, yeah. So under the proposal that's before council, any kind of accessory building or structure, either new or a modification of an existing, would be proposed for delegated permit authorization. Those accessory buildings do need to respect setbacks, all of the provisions within the zoning. So if they were proposing to vary any of the zoning parameters around building, siting, dimensions, or setbacks, those kinds of things, then those variances would come before council.
If I just may add, It would also have to meet the DP area guidelines. So it would have to be completely in line with district guidelines and regulations, and essentially entitled to take place.
I was just wondering about the term substantial in there. It just seems to throw that gray bit in. I was wondering if you'd have perhaps an example, there's a good example there of the size of accessory buildings, or what would be substantial? Can you speak to that differentiation?
If I may, it is a gray area. As with, it's not uncommon to have these gray areas in development of area guidelines, because they're supposed to be guidelines, and so often it would be a judgment call. You know, if it completely changes the look of the building, so even a different color could change that if it's a large enough building. So it would be based on staff interpretation of substantial or not.
Yeah. So then, if something came forward and the deciding officer was to not be sure if that was where that fell, and that it didn't fall in comfort zone, then that just gets kicked over to council at that point.
Yes, I'd say if staff was not comfortable or confident that it is, falls in one or other category, we would have to get more conservative.
So I understand from the last discussion that when something's delegated, it's full stop delegated. But in terms of subjective terms like that, is that full, staff have full authority to interpret those terms, the subjective terms?
Yeah, we do that every day. We interpret the bylaws, and then unless it's disputed by, a member of the public, that's what we'll go with.
So can I do a hypothetical? So a form and character DP gets approved, and there's a certain type of hardy board and it's gray. By the time the developer goes to build, that shade of gray has been discontinued and they want to use a slightly different color of gray. That would be not substantial, that's well within the realm of DP. If they had second thoughts and thought, oh, we saw this great building down in New Orleans and it was red, and now we want to make it red, that's
That would be substantial.
I'm just trying to give some scenarios to council, because you haven't seen a lot of DPs come forward yet, so I'm trying to create some context about where some of this, things that I've seen that I know staff have seen that are not substantial versus substantial. Like adding a floor, substantial, that's,
Yes.
okay.
We noticed that.
So we had one a little while ago where there was an elevator shaft, and it needed to be like 2 feet higher. Is that substantial or not substantial? Because that came back to council for a DVP.
Yes.
But one could argue that making the elevator shaft on the top of the building 2 feet higher to accommodate the elevator and the exit way from the elevator, is that substantial or not substantial?
I think it's likely to be unsubstantial unless it's in a very highly visible location where it's going to have a significant impact. But usually those things do require some form of variances because, developments tend to build out to their maximum ability, and so going higher in those cases requires. So it's a visibility thing as well. If it's going to, a couple of feet on the height of the building could have a substantial impact.
I would add too that within the context of the development permit area guidelines, any proposed changes to an existing development permit do still need to comply with the guidelines. So staff are actively working to ensure that changes are still meeting those guidelines, and where they're straying too far, we're continuously trying to bring them back and sort of in line with those guidelines. I think probably one of the more common amendments to existing DPs often is, maybe a development permit that was issued a long time ago for an older building. They're doing like sort of full facade redo, new windows, new doors, adjusting the placement of the windows and doors or materials, adding screening or sort of additional storage, that kind of stuff. That's probably the most common application for an existing TP. So that's it for the permit delegations. This is just to reiterate that within the procedures bylaw under 11.2, there's a statement overall that says where a development permit also includes any variance to the district zoning bylaw, sign bylaw, or subdivision and development control bylaw, the authority to consider an application for and to issue or refuse a development permit remains with council. So that's an overarching bylaw requirement that's stating any variance would mean that permit would come before council and not be authorized or delegated to staff. So the next slide we brought forward for consideration of council whether at this time council would be interested in expanding or considering expanding approvals or delegated approvals beyond the minor works that are proposed in the bylaw. It was an opportunity that we wanted to present to council, although as was mentioned at the last meeting, it may be too early at this point in time to consider expanding, given that the OCP and the guidelines are new and council hasn't had a lot of time with development permits or temporary use permits. In any event, we wanted to bring forward just some ideas and some comparisons with other communities. So some communities that do have sort of expanded delegation authority for form and character, they do so by different means. So some of them outline geographic areas where they are interested in allowing for greater delegation or sort of having authority around permits to remain with council. Some communities also do so by setting thresholds by development type or by the scale of development. We have some further additional examples that we can highlight for council. Of course, I've lost my piece of paper that shows that. And we could also consider possibly in future some kind of hybrid that highlights a geographic area, and then within that considering delegation of certain permits by development type or scale of development. So the question that we posed to council last week was, is council considering interested in considering this at this time, or would council like us to bring this back at a future date? And if you are interested, is there a certain type of approach that you might be interested in exploring further? So maybe I'll just leave it at that, and then we can open it up for discussion.
Councilor Anderson?
With respect to Sarah's last question for us, it would seem to me that the hybrid approach makes sense. As I look at the examples of the types of projects coming forward, it seems quite intuitive that we may be quite concerned or extra concerned about waterfront planning or downtown planning. And with respect to development type, it would seem to me that if they're major in scale, and maybe that would be something to look at further, that there would also be examples of types of development project major in scale that we would quite naturally be interested in giving extra attention to as council. So I would just suggest the hybrid approach would be makes sense to me. I'll have another question later.
Councilor French and Councilor Reese?
I'm leaning towards leaving major development permit projects with council. No hybrids, just leave it with us.
Forever and ever, or just for now? Or
Just like for now, because we're zoning, let us wrap our heads around what major looks like and where we might feel comfortable in the future.
Councilor Reese? Councilor Fingal?
Thank you. And I agree. I agree with the delegation on the technical aspects from the previous slide. I agree with the delegation that's set out in Schedule A. There's looks like I think there's about 10 items, the minor stuff we were just talking about. I don't think we want to hear about somebody just repainting their building or something like that. But I think for this one, certainly there's new councillors, but also for me, there's a new OCP as well. And so I think this is the time to, maybe for all of us, we just kind of become a little bit more familiar with it. And I don't know how long that might take, but I'm guessing in a year. Come back in a year with that. And I think we'll either find that we're comfortable with that or we're kind of crying uncle for something, because I know in the last term, I know where this has come from. In the last term, there were a lot of comments around expanding the delegation. And so I think that's where this thought has come from and why staff are presenting this to us. We had a whole bunch of things that at the end of the day in reflection we thought were rather minor, and why couldn't staff make that? And whether it's geographic or development, I don't know at this point. I'm guessing it will end up being a hybrid of some kind. I can think of different scenarios, but anyway, I would be inclined to just leave this for the time being and maybe schedule a discussion about it in a year.
Councillor Anderson?
Just had another question regarding future steps, and I wonder if we might return to an early slide with your 6 development approval information area circles. So the OCP sets out in number 1118B, develop and adopt a wildfire hazard development permit area. The OCP also, as I mentioned last time, refers to incorporating heritage assessment in development review. And my question relates to future steps. Now, in the bylaw before us, where development approval information is discussed, that's section 4, we've got our 6 areas that are in that bylaw. And my question is, if we take these steps of developing wildfire hazard or contemplate including heritage asset assessment, then are we looking at coming back to this bylaw as well as the development approval information bylaw and the OCP amendment? Would that be the process we would look at in the future?
Through the chair, so I'll tackle the wildfire piece first as an example. So within the OCP, there is a policy that sets the intention to create the wildfire development permit area as one of for protection from hazardous conditions. That's work that is to come, and I believe there's been some grant application requests to help fund development of that. In terms of process, what that would look like is once a development permit area for wildfire interface areas is established, we would then come back to the procedures bylaw. If it was a technical development permit area that we wanted to delegate to staff, that council wanted to delegate to staff to deal with in the same way that is being proposed for environmental DPs and flood protection development permits, we would then have to establish an amendment or process an amendment to the procedures bylaw to allow those that technical development permit area to be delegated as well. So there would be an amendment there, and also we would need to tweak our fees and charges bylaw to set a fee for any kind of standalone permit or integrated permit to twin that with the new development permit area. And then for heritage assessment, so as I mentioned last week, heritage impact, I guess, is not set out at this time as a development approval information area. In section 29 of the 27, sorry, of the official community plan, we do have a budget policy that we've set around heritage conservation, and specifically policy through the development process to work with landowners and developers to incorporate natural, cultural, and built heritage resources in their projects. And so through and within the form and character development permit area guidelines, there's also touchstones on heritage conservation as well. And so through development review, we do consider those values. But in terms of process and procedure, we're not working with like a inventory or registry at this time. But we are considering those within review kind of in general terms.
Thank you.
Councillor Trent,
So just building a little bit off of, I think, Councillor Anderson's questions, I was wondering in terms of the info requirements as well, and in the context of our strategic plan, about GHG and energy water efficiency impacts, maybe deconstruction disposal impacts as, things that at some point, and maybe this isn't the time to do it, but thinking about adding those as info requirements, and even if we don't make them an absolute yay or nay on approving something, at least getting people thinking about these things, maybe there's some value in that. So, and heritage values may play along with that too. So I'll just kind of throw that out there. On the bigger philosophical question, I guess my feeling is that we're better served, whether it's council or staff making the decision, if it's guided by clear policy. And if there is very clear policy in place, it's hard for me to think of why we wouldn't really delegate a lot to staff. So I guess for me the question is, do we have the sufficient policy in place to delegate a lot of this to staff and feel comfortable with staff making those decisions? And that's my inclination, is to get us to that point where that policy is in place, we're comfortable with it, and staff have there's a large delegation to staff.
so that time is not currently now, is what I take from your conversation.
Yeah, I think there may be some gaps, so then I think it's more to council is making a little bit more ad hoc, I would say gently, decisions, but maybe that's where we are for now. But I would hope there's a place for us to think about where we can address those policy gaps and then get back to delegating along these things.
Knowing that there's a delay between when we adopt new policy and when we start to see DPs coming in under that policy, we haven't seen a lot that reflect the new OCP or the new universal guidelines for multifamily, commercial, industrial. Does staff have a sense of when we'll start to see more of those?
If I may, through the chair, yes, I think it's when we're going to start seeing those coming through probably in the next couple of months. All the applications that have been submitted after the OCP was adopted are in process, so I think it's routed soon.
One of the comments in the staff report around organizational impact is that that it's estimated that projects that are eligible for delegated approval would see a reduction in processing timelines of 5 to 6 weeks on average, because it doesn't have to go before council. But that departmental application review times would not be anticipated to be affected by the expanded delegation. And I'm assuming that as we delegate more to you, Mr. Valencius, what is your role in reviewing current DPs that come through the organization, and how, if we're delegating more to you, it doesn't impact your ability to do more with the same amount of time?
If I may. So currently, some of the delegated authority is with the general manager. So all of the delegated permits, including the temporary use permits, they go to the general manager. And then the liquor stuff comes to me. I think the statement in there was not so much concerned with my time, but with the overall time of the application. Right now, we because the nature of the permits is so minor, the review is not to the same level as something that goes to council. So I think what we're anticipating is that if greater delegation happens, we're going to have to build out a very similar review process to the applications that go to council. And so if we didn't change our process, it would take a lot faster to process these permits. But because I have to review everything that goes to council from the planning function, I will still have to review those things. It's just at the end of the day, I will be signing them off.
I mean, one imagines that delegations are about speeding things up.
Yes, but the other benefit of delegations is that it then allows council more time to do other things. It doesn't jam up the agendas as we've seen it sort of happen in the last term.
Any other questions or comments, Council?
During the review of a delegated authority in general, does it allow for more back and forth than at the council table? I find that we can send things back to staff to go and talk to the proponent and come up, try to figure out something that would be potentially more agreeable to council and bring it forward, but is that back and forth a normal part of your, as you work through this delegated things, you can actually sort of get there sooner rather than come with something that's close, but council doesn't quite like to do that. Again, that's sort of maybe that policy.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is part of that. The other benefit, I think, of delegation is that those permits would have to meet every guideline, all the zoning requirements. So I think there would be a bigger incentive for applicants to comply, even if there's a minor variance that they want. It might be worth it not just to meet the bylaw.
No, I appreciate that sentiment. I think I'm with Councillor Pengil, I think, and Councillor Race, where I think that's where I'd like to end up. I'm comfortable with all the stuff that's there already, but just that last bit, working with the new OCP and just seeing how that works, I think is where I'd like to spend some time with that before I feel comfortable putting more out there, so that to ensure that we're with those guidelines and that criteria set up as bulletproof as it can be, so that we're getting the outcomes that we want as a council. So that's where I'm at on this. And maybe we set that out as to line up with zoning bylaw review time, which is about a year. There's a timeline to do it.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? We can't actually amend the DPA guidelines without doing an OCP review, correct? That's correct. So
OCP amendment.
Amendment. Yeah, so I mentioned this last time when we talked about this. I'm with Councilor Race on this, that I would like to spend a year trying to just see what the new DPA guidelines look like in terms of actually applying them. As it's mentioned earlier, the guidelines are just guidelines. There's a lot of kind of justification in there and subjectivity that can be brought in. And I think that it'd be helpful just to spend some time with everybody trying to figure out what that actually looks like as more.
I think because we haven't seen the new DPA guidelines in action, I'm hesitant to delegate more for the former character DPs until we see that happen. I also think that once we benchmark our community GHGs and sort of figure out what our targets are after this year, that we may find that we need to adjust our DP area guidelines, the universal guidelines anyway, in terms of helping our community achieve not only the step code, but the net zero ready homes by 2032. And so this piece around making sure that we're comfortable with the policy and what it does to the built form, I think are important. And I recall a comment in recent ADP minutes where a proponent's proposing a passive house multifamily development, and one of the comments from a member of the ADP was, well, it's pretty blocky. If you just don't do a passive house, and the building will look better. And the whole point of passive house is that they need to be more rectangular and less articulation so that they can be easier to make, trying to say.
Seal.
Yeah, to achieve the seal, to make them energy efficient. And so to have an ADP member in this day and age say, well, you should just not do passive house, when so few people are doing passive house, like that is a good thing for our community, not a bad thing. that I'm worried that our form and character DPs may actually show us that we're slowing down the ability for more people to adopt that because we're asking for building articulation rather than material articulation to achieve visual interest. So I think those are some of the things that as we go forward we want to pay attention to, because I think there are more builders out there now who are looking at step code, looking at passive home. We want to make sure that our DP area guidelines are not getting in the way of them doing that in an easier way. The other thing for me, I think, in delegating larger DPs is our reporting function. And so right now, there's not a lot of feedback to council about how many complaints are we getting from the public about things we've built. And so how do we evaluate our own policy? Because we hear some feedback, but maybe not all. And I wonder what the reporting would look like in terms of delegating more and what council would see back. So how many DPs were approved? Where were they? What's been the impact? So I think that's something for staff to contemplate if this is going to come back. And I think we should think about it again during our term about if there's space to do more delegation. But what would the reporting look like? How would council make good fact-based and data-driven decision about its own policy if we release a larger delegated authority to staff? Because we are as Councillor Pettingill says, we should be comfortable with our own policy. Like there's that sense there that if you're sure of your policy, you would delegate more to staff. But then how do you evaluate that policy is having the impact that it's supposed to have? And you're getting the form and character that you as a council anticipated. So I think when this conversation comes back, we've got to pay attention a bit more to the reporting function that would happen with that larger delegated authority. Can we just quickly go through each slide about the technical delegations that you want to do? I just want to make sure that council is saying yes to each and every single one and doesn't have any hesitation.
Before we do that, I just wanted to, if I might, just make an additional comment around that evaluation and the feedback looping around delegated permits. Certainly, community planning used to provide sort of a list of active development files, and you can actually check that out on the GIS as well, but there might be an opportunity through the showcase as well for us to basically provide sort of a list of active development applications that are and the different approval streams that they're going in. So there's an opportunity for us to look at greater awareness and notification and public awareness of those different permits. And it's interesting just the point that was raised around passive houses and design guidelines. And when we went through the OCP update and the form and character development permit area guidelines, we did work with ADP around those guidelines and had some interesting discussion. And I think there is that trying to find that balancing act between kind of new progressive building performance standards and then what is the aesthetic and the form and character shift that is happening simultaneously. And it's kind of that idea of form follows function, or aesthetic form follows function. And I think it's something that ADP has been talking about, so it's definitely on the radar, and those conversations are happening. And I think we will, over time, start to be able to see a shift in guidelines and kind of the aesthetic to kind of mirror and allow for the building performance to kind of take the lead, and then also to see how we can ensure we have a lively, vibrant built form, and that the aesthetic qualities are interesting and attractive as well. So we'll find that balance point. So back to,
I think we got a question from Councillor Race here.
Well, and just to comment on that, because I was thinking when we were talking about this earlier, on Councillor Pettingill's point about the policy, it's, I mean, there is an element of subjectivity in this form of character, and it's hard to kind of legislate that. But I think if we, over the coming year, if we try to build some benchmarks or some structure to that, so that when we are delegating, there's less anxiety, I guess is maybe the word. And it struck me that that's one of the other things we haven't had yet, and I know we're having another thing on committees, but periodically, and maybe every quarter, we could almost have a planning debrief and go through the applications and the DPs and have an opportunity to have a discussion while things are a little bit more fresh in our minds as we kind of build up to what will be a conversation, I guess, about a year from now. So just a thought that occurred to me when we were chatting away about this.
Mayor Elliott, is this the slide that you were hoping to?
Yeah, I just wanted to go through each of the delegations that you are asking us for, aside from the form and character ones, just to make sure that council is going to, because there's only one motion in front of us, I want to make sure that council is okay with each of them.
Yeah, I guess there's this slide that details the development permit delegations. On a previous slide, we have the temporary use permit delegation, so I'll just pop back to that one. And this is just a summary, so it's within the bylaw itself that's appended to the report that details this. But essentially for temporary use permits, which is the fourth bullet there, basically currently the bylaw allows for the director to authorize temporary use permits of 185 square meters or less. It's around 2,000 square feet. Except there are, sorry, my brain's catching up. There are a number of exclusions to that. So currently liquor sales is excluded. And what we've done is we've added cannabis retail as well as retail sale of tobacco, e-cigarettes, vaporizers, and associated vaporizer products. You'll see in the bylaw, it's detailed there. So those would be additional exclusions. So any temporary use permit application that included cannabis, retail sale of tobacco, or tobacco products would not be eligible for delegated approval. Those would all come to council. So we haven't proposed to change the square footage or the area. They're for small, less than 2,000 square foot temporary use proposals. The most common temporary use proposal or application that we've processed in the past have been to support festivals and events, so around parking and associated uses that are kind of accessory to Squamish Valley Music Festival was probably the largest, we incurred the largest number of temporary use permit applications because of that event.
So council, any issues with adding those to that temporary use delegation? Those exclusions? I guess we're adding exclusions to a currently existing delegation for TDP. Right. Oh, good. Oh, Councilor Pena.
Just a question on DPA 1 and 2. So at the start of the DPA, there's a purpose section, and then in the rest of the development area, it gets into specifics. How much, in your evaluation, if this goes forward, does the purpose play where, some of the detailed guidelines, maybe they aren't quite applicable, or you feel, despite those or notwithstanding those, the proponent's off base on the overall purpose, and that gets pretty subjective, but how much does that or can that play, or would that play into your decisions?
If I may, through your chair, the main substance are the guidelines in the development permit area. The purpose is just a statement. So I think a lot more weight goes into the guidelines than in purpose.
So if were that to happen, and maybe this is an edge case that will never hit, but someone's technically complying with all the guidelines, but way off base on the purpose, is that a situation where you would approve them because that's what we've got, but then come to council and say, hey, we had this situation and we're kind of feeling uncomfortable about the purpose piece and maybe we should try and address this, or how would that flow?
If I might, through the chair, the purpose statements that are outlined within the development permit areas are really basically parroting the legislation. And so, for example, for DPA 2, the purpose, DPA 2 is established for the protection of development from hazardous conditions. That's reflecting back our authority to designate lands for protection of development from hazardous conditions. So the purpose statements in and of themselves are, as Jonas said, it's the guidelines themselves that are the substantive pieces that the development is considered against. But municipalities are required to outline the purpose and the justification for setting a development permit area designation, for setting those up. So yeah, those are just not as important necessarily. They're important from a legislative authority perspective, but it's the guidelines that really are the things that the development is weighed against. I'm not sure if that.
If I may add, in other words, if an application meets all the guidelines, then a permit is, the applicant is entitled to a permit extension.
But for example, the purpose for DPA 1, the first bullet, is designated for the protection of the natural environment, its ecosystems and biodiversity, which is obviously pretty broad. But if hypothetically met all the guidelines, but they're ruining a key ecosystem, is the end result. So, based on our policy, they might get this approval. What or if or when is a trigger when you might say to council like, hey, we think we missed something here because they hit all the guidelines, but this overall purpose piece, we think they're off the mark. How would that flow?
I think that's part of the feedback loop and the evaluation piece that's been raised already. So if applications and permits are coming forward that are missing the mark, notwithstanding maybe they were meeting the guidelines, then that's a signal that we need to go back and revisit the guidelines to make sure that those guidelines are meeting and fulfilling the overall purpose of the development permit area designation itself. For development permit area 1, certainly there's a lot of guidelines. We've expanded exponentially the guidelines here and tried to sort of hit all the key elements around ecosystems, biodiversity, habitat connectivity, and habitat integrity, but there's always room for improvement. So we can absolutely revisit that if council or community feel like there's gaps.
I do want to caution that there are some limitations, particularly to the natural environment protection guidelines that have been established through legislation and case law. So, you can't, for instance, have guidelines that completely prevent development on the property, or that simply protect vegetated areas. There has to be something special about those areas that are subject to the guidelines and the protection in the guidelines. But essentially, the guidelines are aiming, that is how the OCPA aims to achieve the purpose of the guidelines of the development permit area.
Does that answer your question, Councilor Fagan?
Yeah, can I add a comment?
Sure.
So, yeah, and I guess where I'm thinking is, I guess I would like to sort of see, or in my mind, it would be ideal if the guidelines were necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. And they're there where we're less comfortable giving staff discretion, and so they're more specific. A purpose is a higher level. It is still delegated. We're allowing for more interpretation, but still expecting that to be applied. So I would still expect staff to look at that, protection of the natural environment, ecosystems, biodiversity, and think generally, are we protecting that, and to kind of raise some flags or start waving or doing something if we thought we were off base sooner rather than later. And just so that we're not sort of ignoring the purpose piece and only planning guidelines, if that makes sense. Understanding again that there's a lot more discretion available in the purpose because it is so big.
Yes, I think we certainly want to keep monitoring whether we're achieving the purpose, and if we're not achieving the purpose, then there's probably other things that we could do through other zoning bylaw and other pieces of legislation rather than the guidelines.
And I think too, this is a piece where the business of the district all becomes connected, because our OCP monitoring will also let us know if we're missing the purpose of some of our DP area guidelines, and also the feedback from the community. So I think that's something that as council members, we always have to be alive to the fact that we'll get continuous feedback, and the place we can affect change is in policy. And so if we see the opportunity that we can make DP area guidelines 1 through 13 stronger, that's something that each councillor should feel confident to raise and bring to committee. Because we can't anticipate everything in each of our DP area guidelines, but we should respond if they're not achieving what we hope they would. So while staff can review the guidelines with the purpose in mind, it's also up to council to be mindful that what we see in the community is reflecting the purpose set out in those DP area guidelines as well. So I think it's incumbent on both sides of the table to do that. Councillor Race?
Thank you. And just listening to the comments and questions, I think we have to remind ourselves that we have very, very limited discretion on a DP application generally, and I'm not here to give legal advice, but I am here to tell you about an experience in my first term where we had a decision on a DP that we turned down, set aside by Supreme Court, because that is the remedy of the proponent, and the court forced us to issue the DP, and it was for a building on the water side of a dike, which you might say common sense would tell you we should never be doing, but nevertheless our guidelines were not tight enough. And so while we might want to go back and check the guidelines, the decision in front of us is not going to be affected by a future change to the guidelines. So we have to think when we're making that decision, what are the guidelines? And otherwise go back into the guidelines if we want to change them and change it as an amendment to the OCP, of course. But we really have very limited discretion in these things, otherwise we can end up in Supreme Court very quickly and not satisfactory for us.
Yeah, if you had a council superpower, it'd be able to change policy on the fly. But not allowed. Okay, so on the temporary use permit delegation and the additions, I think you're good. On the liquor and cannabis license referral, so adding the cannabis piece to the delegation. Council, is everyone generally kind of show of hands, we're okay with this one? Yeah, but any variances would still come back to council on that one? Okay, that one's good. Can we go to the slide with the DP area 1 and 2? Oh wait, did we miss that one with the circle?
Development approval information areas. There's no delegation there, but there's a whole series of procedures within the bylaw around requiring this information.
So it's all there now.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what was fun? Okay, this one. So is council okay with delegating standalone permits for DPA 1 and 2? Let's start with that question. Is council okay with delegating minor works to DP areas 4 to 13 as detailed there?
Just for clarification, that's the D1 to 1 to 9 in the Schedule A. It's a little bit more expanded than what we see there, but that's what we're talking about
here. This came to mind when I was channeling some former council members. And, you know, there was an ask always for developers to provide a 3D model or a flyby when they present their projects so that we get a sense of the impact on the surrounding neighborhood. And is this a place where we capture that? Because that was never captured, it was sort of voluntary by developers. And I know this counselor was always pounding the table like, where's the 3D model and where's the flyby? And we got it from a few developers, but not all. And so if council was interested in seeing that for larger developments, what the impact was on shade and the surrounding neighborhood, do we enshrine that in this bylaw?
I am very pleased to tell council that we have prescribed this in our land development application form. So there's a laundry list of specific site plans, renderings, elevations, 3D modeling. And so we're just working on the sort of the fine print there that's required. And it's going to be, like, not every project probably is going to warrant extensive 3D modeling, so we do need to land on good guidance, but certainly when typically through pre-application meetings that we host with applicants, we go through the development checklist and all their information requirements, so we can definitely bring that back in front of council if you're interested to see how we've prescribed that in the form. And through the procedures bylaw, there's all of our land development application forms are prescribed by staff, but by the director. And the reason for that is that if we need to make adjustments to that, we don't have to actually do a full bylaw amendment for a form. So most communities prescribe their application forms, and those are prescribed by staff.
Thank you, that's good. I'm happy to hear that. My only concern still on this one, I guess it's not a concern. So if there's a new accessory building and it doesn't meet our setbacks, it'll come back. Okay. Oh, and the final one, the outdoor patios, seating areas, sidewalk cafes. It says are consistent with the guidelines set out in the District of Squamish Sidewalk Cafe Bylaw 1469-1997. Is that bylaw, like, so, right, this is the confidence that our policy is relevant, and is that policy actually relevant still?
Yeah.
Is that something council, I don't know, it just seemed like a long time ago.
Yeah.
And times have changed.
Through the chair, I will have to get confirmation. I do think that we have amended, that was the initial sidewalk cafe bylaw, but we did amend it to reduce the cost for basically renting sidewalk space for activating cafes and patios down to 0. So we are not charging commercial businesses to rent out that space from us, but we do, if there are major fixtures and things within that sort of encroachment area, we do typically do a delegated DP to sign off on seating, fencing, any kind of like canopies or things that are kind of encroaching into that public space. But we do still have that bylaw.
Okay. But if that's the most recent version, so again, I mean, we do want to see our streets activated, and I was just wondering if 1997 was in the same vein.
Yeah, that's the original bylaw, but it has been amended over time.
Okay. I think that was my last question on that minor works piece. And just a general question about the bylaw, there's a section 16 that says subdivisions, but we have a subdivision and control bylaw, so I was wondering why that line was in there. It just says the approving officer may exempt a parcel from the minimum frontage required under the Local Government Act. And why that's here and not in the subdivision and control bylaw.
Yeah. Do you want to take that? Yeah.
Answer that, if I may. So because it's a procedural question about delegated authority. In the Local Government Act basically allows for either this authority to be delegated to a approving officer or to be with council. And in this case, it's a procedural step where it's delegated. It has to be in this file.
Okay, thanks. If there aren't any more questions, then do you have the
Recommendation. We would just request a date change.
Subject to council input provided on February 26th and March 5th. Staff be directed to bring forward updated bylaws to the District of Squamish, development procedures bylaw number 229/2012 and fees and charges bylaw 2012-2017 for consideration of formal bylaw reading. Moved by Councilor Race, seconded by Councilor Stoner. Any further discussion, council? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries.
Thank you, council. We will be bringing these bylaws back in early April.
Thank you. Our next item on the agenda is the LMLGA Resolutions Discussion. Noticing seemed to be a bit strange from LMLGA on this. I didn't remember getting a notice of it until I saw the email from Jack Norman. I don't know if you guys saw an earlier email from LMLGA asking for a call for a resolution.
There was, as I recall.
Was there?
Yes.
Okay, so our deadline is March 15th, although Jack said there could be some leniency if we were a little bit late on that. All these go to the board of the LMLGA and they decide what will hit the floor of the conference as block resolutions versus those that will be voted on individually. So that's why there's a deadline. They all go to the floor, but they either go in as a block or they go in individually, and the board of the LMLGA will also make recommendations whether to endorse, not endorse, or no recommendation. So that's why there's this deadline. And just for a reminder, UBCM does like to see resolutions pass through the area association first before they go to the floor of UBCM. It does carry some weight with the UBCM board to know that the area association is behind it. That's not to say that you can't put forward a resolution to UBCM without it going to the area association as well. So, how this works is generally councilors propose resolutions. They're for discussion by council and we vote on them. And if you've got the wording, that is helpful. And if we need to bring it back next week, we can finalize the wording next week and put it on a special meeting so that they're approved in time to go to LMLGA. Did anybody have any resolutions they wanted to put forward?
Just a question about our use, if you like, of the LMLGA. If a resolution that might come from District of Squamish is on a topic like the railway or natural resources, given that the Lower Mainland group is largely an urban municipality, is that relevant at all, or would we still take any resolution we propose through that route?
I always think it's helpful to remember that there are 33 different municipalities represented in LMLGA, and they're not all urban. And in fact, many of them do have industrial and railway related issues. Now, take New West, for example, has lots of railway interface issues. So I think it's helpful, and it's interesting when we get to UBCM, you know, we are voting on resolutions that have to do with ungulate control, which is not an issue in our area necessarily, but we're asked to vote on that for regions across the province. So I think it is useful to take them to LMLGA. If they're not endorsed, you still have the option of putting it forward to UBCM.
Two things. One, can you explain a little bit further what a block is? That a group of resolutions that are the same topic, and you're kind of picking the one to take forward, or a variation to take forward? Is that...
A block are resolutions that the board feels are strong enough in their own right that we don't need to vote on them individually. They're generally on different topics, not the same topic. If there are resolutions on the same topic, they will generally select one that is stronger to put, and we would vote on it individually, and that the other one will be further back in the agenda.
And then I guess a bit similar to
Oh,
Council.
and just so you know, like we do our mail, our consent agenda, the block resolutions are like a consent agenda. And so members from the floor can stand at the conference and pull resolutions from that block. So if you believe that one of the resolutions that's in the block, that the board's put in the block, actually is controversial and should be voted on by the whole body separately, you can stand asked to pull that from the block, and if it's seconded and we vote, it can get pulled from the block. Down at the conference. So.
And then similar to Councillor Anderson's question, is the intent of this to be on topics that are applicable to at least one other municipality, or is this a place to get other municipalities sometimes to endorse things that are really only relevant in Squamish, for example?
I'm like, Council Race is really thinking cap on here, but going back to prior resolutions that we've successfully passed. So after we went through our 3 environmental assessment experiences in Squamish, we put forward a number of resolutions to improve that process. One of them was adding fees for municipal government to the fee structure. So right now, the provincial government is paying fees by proponents to process the application. And while we're expected to put staff on working groups and also to respond to these EAs, we get no fees. So that was one that we put forward to LMLGA, and it passed there and got almost unanimous endorsement. In fact, I think it got unanimous endorsement at UBCM because other communities could see the benefit or the impact that they also went through that of what it would do them. So that was an example of one where that was based on our own experience here, but we felt had applicability across the body. Please talk about who you report.
I think from my perspective, it's helpful to remember who the target of these resolutions is going to be, which is typically the province and sometimes the feds. And so there's rarely an issue that just applies to one municipality. And usually what we're trying to do in this process is gather combined support to make a stronger case with the senior government. So, I mean, I guess there's probably an exception, but most often somebody else somewhere in the province or in the local region will have a similar issue and have similar complaint usually, or whatever the issue might be. But I think they try to change policy at senior government. That's the goal of it, somehow to fix the problem that we perceive.
Councillor French and myself have recently been directors of the Squamish Chamber of Commerce at a time when a policy resolution was endorsed by the Chamber Board to encourage liaison with the district, with council here, on approaches for the UBCM and the BC Chamber AGM, respectively. The BC Chamber Convention, which Councillor Pettingill has also attended, that takes place in May. So the idea was to exchange information as best as we can, and there have been some common topics of interest like regional transit, among other things, where we can work together just to optimize our potential impact on the province, if you like, and use these both forums in a more or less coordinated way. Maybe that's something we might bring up in future informal chats, perhaps with the Chamber of Commerce, just that exchange of information.
Certainly one of the resolutions I was going to ask Council about is whether we wanted to put one forward on the BC Assessment Act and starting to alter that so that community high streets are not assessed at highest and best use, but rather at current built form in order to protect local businesses and small town high streets. And I know that's one of the issues that has been raised through the BC Chamber of Commerce. It also affects large cities as well. So there have been some stories recently about some neighborhood stores in downtown Vancouver that have been a part of the West End community for a long time, and they've had to close because they can no longer afford their lease rates. Because the land that they are leasing on is now being assessed, tens of millions of dollars, not hundreds. So that was certainly one. If council was interested, I'm willing to work on the wording for that and bring it back next week. But I wanted to get through the questions, so anyway, but that is certainly yes. I am taking in conversations with the chamber, we've been talking about this, and we would work with Louise on reflecting that in the language. Councillor?
Well, I agree with that one for sure, and there was an article in the Vancouver Sun, and it's not just the scenario we've been dealing with where ground floor commercial is getting assessed based on the potential value of floors of residential above it. It's also happening in purely industrial or commercial scenarios where the assessment is based on the potential market rent, not the rent that's actually being charged. And that was actually a surprise to me, frankly, because I can remember when I was in the private sector, the assessment guy came in and quizzed me about our rent because that was forming part of their appraisal process. So, so I think that's another thing, because same thing has the effect. In this case, I think they were talking about craft breweries. There's an article about that. Yeah, so it was causing the assessments to go up remarkably, and just because of the potential rent increases, notwithstanding the fact that these were locked down buildings under long-term leases, etc., with pretty fixed rents. The tax component was going up quite a lot. So same issue at the end of the day, but it's not just because of the impact of residential.
Councillor Anderson?
Two areas that I thought might be of interest to pursue in terms of resolutions for District Squamish are on the themes of natural resource roads and BCR properties. However, I think that the natural resource roads issue, to start there, I think that perhaps it might be better for us to, we are going to be exposed to the issues of costs, liability, public engagement regarding natural resource roads in connection with a community forest agreement. So in future, we will have that much more direct experience to those issues for us to bring a resolution forward. We have been involved with it in the past, that is the District of Squamish and Resort Municipality of Worcester have been involved with natural resource road resolutions at UBCM decades ago, a decade ago perhaps. And it's been a sleeper on the part of the province. So the idea would be to stimulate the province to bring that whole file off the shelf and engage again with municipalities and stakeholders around it.
What is that issue?
The issue is who pays for them. If it's just going to be natural resource industries such as hydro, logging, or mining, then recreational access, how does that fit into it in terms of sharing the costs? Right now they don't, and therefore, and the liabilities in terms of maintaining these roads, and public engagement about planning for road closures or road maintenance. All of these issues have come forward there's a UBCM discussion document on this topic, which is very good. But the provincial government, that would be the last government, shelved that initiative for the time being, and it hasn't really been, there's been no re-engagement with it. In our area, it's very topical and has come up in our recent discussions with Jordan Sturdy, if I'm not mistaken. The other issue I propose that may be of interest in BCR properties, I think perhaps there's a little bit more work on our part to be done. It's been suggested by MLA Jordan Sturdy that we take the lead and maybe coming up with our own vision for some of these lands, more than has been done so far, and more liaison with other municipalities that share some of these issues. But that may be, and it is also a topic that has, with Quesnel and Williams Lake, the District of Squamish has been there at UBCM with resolutions in the past, working with these other railway line municipalities, sharing these issues. So perhaps we might, at the UBCM conference, maybe share informally some information and build towards some idea of a resolution. in future.
Yeah, the one thing we have to be careful of is not repeating resolutions, because UBCM will reject those, because they've already been dealt with in their mind. So would they have to further something new or create a new direction or amend direction that was already given, especially if they were endorsed by UBCM, because they still see them as live. So
Yes.
that's one thing to keep in mind, is to make sure you go back and look at what has previously been passed, so that we're not repeating. Councilor Reeves?
Yeah, thank you. Councilor Anderson, great minds think alike. We actually...
There's another line.
Is there?
Yeah.
When we were at UBCM last year, we had a meeting with Minister Trevina, and we raised the issue jointly with Mayor Cobb from Williams Lake about the use of BC Rail lands, or getting BC Rail property lands for community purposes. And in Mayor Cobb's case, or Williams Lake's case, it was some critical lands for road widening and also a recreational trail. And he was faced with issues that we faced in the past of BC Rail properties coming back to us and having an appraisal and wanting to charge a lot of money for some of these pieces of property. In our submission, we didn't have a trail in mind, but we were thinking about possible sites for future housing projects, much like we're doing on Buckley Avenue, because we really, based on that review, we really don't have any other additional sites kind of handy that might be available. And BC Rail Properties, as you know, has lands right up the old rail line. I mean, not every municipality in British Columbia certainly, but a significant amount right up through the center of the province. So we made the point that, or tried to make the point that they should be providing lands to communities for designated community purposes like this, as opposed to just for-profit development, redevelopment, where you charge what you want for that kind of stuff, but don't charge communities an arm and a leg for these things that are of a more community and social purpose. So far, we haven't seen any change in policy on that, but that's something that I think UBCM was just the 2 municipalities that we're talking. If we had more, we might be able to put a little bit more leverage on it. So certainly I wouldn't hesitate to put something like that there. I think that's a good example of it.
So that would be about the mandate of PCR properties.
Yeah, apparently, and there would be more work to do on it, but apparently there was a mandate which dates back to the sale of, almost the sale of BC Rail. It goes back to 2004 or 5, something like that. People were talking about where BC Rail Properties was instructed to get the best dollar for all of these pieces of property, which is, as I say, appropriate in some cases, but maybe not when we're talking about using them for things that are also consistent with provincial initiatives, provincial government initiatives, this particular government, housing being an example.
So I have a clarifying question about, just trying to understand your proposal a little better. And I'm presuming part of the answer is that there's already resolutions on the books, but in terms of like a different way to theoretically address assessment values is, okay, fine, assess at highest and best value, but we want to designate and tax based on high street commercial. And so the assessment is what it is, but we don't want to be stuck with the commercial bucket and only commercial bucket for figuring out our property taxation. So, why ask for an adjustment to the how they are assessing versus more granularity in designating, which tax bucket your property falls into, like 3 different industrial zones and 3 different commercial zones for tax purposes, or some other thing that gives us more control over taxation municipally.
The reason for proposing a change to the BC Assessment Act is because those landlords they're probably tied together. Just trying to follow that. It may be both, Councillor Peggia. And I know last year, West Vancouver put forward a motion to to increase the number of classes in the tax act to allow for us to have more granularity. I can't remember which way that one went, actually. But I can go back and look. But I do think that the first place that we impact change is at the assessment level. That's the first step. And if those are all getting assessed at their highest and best use rather than current use, then that impacts what they pay in tax, and that gets passed on to people leasing that space. So that's why I started there, but it's not to say that we couldn't do both. But I'm happy to go back and look at the one that West Vancouver brought forward. I'm not sure that actually addressed commercial space. I think it was actually to provide more granularity on residential, so that you could tax a single-family home differently than you tax a condo. But I'm not sure that anyone's put forward a change around commercial or use. Oh wait, Councilor Ford.
I'm going to change subject, so if you had something for that one.
It was.
Okay.
And I just remembered the other issue that came up with this highest and best use for residential was in protection of old stock residential, where if they're assessed at what the market rent might be for that unit, which may not have any relation to the existing rental structure, then the assessment's going to go way up. But the landlord, who in those cases doesn't necessarily pass on the taxes like they do in commercial things where you have triple net leases and so forth, the landlord now has to pay these higher taxes, but the rent increases are restricted by provincial legislation. And you can say, well, who cares about the landlord? But the problem is that leads to the landlord tearing down and redeveloping the building earlier than they might otherwise do it, just because otherwise they're going to be inevitably operating at a loss. So there's that component to this assessment anomaly as well.
Thank you,
I wanted to just talk briefly about another, something I've been thinking about. And I've been torn with this one because I work with bicycles. There's a bicycle taxation thing that I'd like to sort of talk about with everybody here and see what everyone thinks about it. So essentially what's happening right now is, I'm not sure if everyone's tried an e-bike. I should try an e-bike. Basically, my understanding is that we get less of what gets taxed, we get less of. So think of it, cigarettes, alcohol. And e-bikes create accessibility for people who previously would have needed to or chosen to drive, and that should be encouraged. So there's a tag right now. Bicycles are exempt from provincial tax, and on one end, the other end is bookended by high-end electric vehicles, which are incentivized, and e-bikes for some reason still get the full tax. It just seems like a weird and a fairly simple fix. We've got some other issues that granted are larger and have larger implications and are more complex. This seems very simple and it's out of step with the current taxation and current policy. It seems like something that we could do about it. Now I'm aware of it because I deal with in that business, so I want to make sure this is something that everyone is aware of, even because outside of that it may not, but we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on active transportation, and that e-bike portion is the most accessible. Well, bicycles are, of course, but as we move up through that spectrum into e-bikes, I mean, right now our province is financially encouraging residents to purchase luxury electronic vehicles, and then unduly taxing residents who choose to or need to opt for more affordable options. So it just seems out of step, and there's lots of more education about it amongst ourselves. I was feeling a little, it's an interesting one, but it's a whole, and I don't think it lines up with our OCP and our strategic goals, greenhouse gas, so that all ticks all those boxes, and I think it's out of step with the province's energy green plan as well. So just seems like it's a forgotten vortex there somehow, and I think we could perhaps give it a voice. Anyone?
So given that Councillor Herford, works in the bicycle industry, does it put him in conflict to bring this as a motion forward to LMLGA?
I think for Councillor Herford to bring it to the table here, but if there's a decision to be made or a motion to be developed once now that the topic is here, I think we've had councillors in the past who've done the same thing. They've brought up issues that were based on greater community good and the principles. They're very values-based and on the principles of the strategic plan of the time, the OCP, but then they didn't take part in the discussion, and we've had healthcare, we've had motor vehicles, we've had all those things like that. So the issue comes up, but they're not part of the actual vote.
So could Councillor Herford craft the resolution, or does he need to pass it on to another councillor to?
If he has the information, I'm sure he can provide the information, but he wouldn't be part of the discussion for the meeting.
Okay.
That's my high-level take on it. But it's up to Councillor Herford, of course.
Yeah, it's up to Councillor Herford. Maybe Councillor Herford will be treading on some shaky ground there, but I think it's a topic that I think it's a resolution that would get a ton of uptake at LMLGA, and I can tell you in the last 4 years that it hasn't hit the radar. So if there was a councillor that wanted to grab that information from Councillor Herford, unless you want to insist on being part of the debate.
No, I don't want to insist on being part of it, but I wanted to bring it to everyone's attention that that hole exists, and if there's interest in someone to, or the group to run it, that I can provide some, but then.
I'm happy to take this offline with you.
I do. I think that one will get support, actually. Any others, Councillor?
I'd like to bring forward the idea of putting forward another resolution around sustainable funding for BC Search and Rescue. I know this is something that's come up with UBCM a few times in a row, but given the most recent provincial budget and there's no sign in the near future for a sustainable funding model for search and rescue, it significantly impacts our community. Given the rate of instances that they're seeing, increasing probably in step, I'd say, with the amount of funding that's going into tourism BC and marketing material that they're putting into outdoor recreation at this time. So I'd like to put forward a resolution on that if others are comfortable.
Yeah, comfortable, and I think that's the kind of resolution that we might want to get Lions Bay, West Van, North Van, and North Van aligned with, because we all have this very localized combination, and maybe others, perhaps. But it seems to be really concentrated right around this area right around here, with the proximity to Vancouver. So absolutely. But, and I guess it's just a general comment. I mean, it would seem to me that there'd be more force if 5 municipalities brought it into LMLGA as opposed to just one. So we can usually touch base and see if we can get those presents out.
If I'm not mistaken, there is some resolution history at the UBCM on this topic. My question to you, Mayor Elliott, is that also on natural resource roads, I'm curious to check out the resolution history on that one as well. There is a staff member at UBCM who I've had dealings with in the past who's extremely helpful on this stuff. I've been involved with the SLRD at the UBCM in the past. Perhaps we can take that route to inquire, and could we do so directly, contacting directly, or should that be done through your staff member?
No, all the previous resolutions are available on the website, and each year there's a report out about what was endorsed at each conference and then what was moved forward by the UBCM, but you may also contact UBCM to get information. You don't need to work through the mayor.
Okay, thank you.
So at the risk of being a bit provocative, I wonder, and
do it.
Appreciate some feedback from those of you who have attended UBCM about whether it would have the effect I'm imagining. But we hear a lot of statements about the need to have at the very least a moratorium on fracking and to move away from the fossil industry, pipelines, so on and so forth. And as true as those things may be, I think the feeling in certain areas of BC, northeastern BC is, yeah, but what about us and what does that do to us and so on? And is there an opportunity to move forward on those things, but try and find a way to bring us together? So a resolution, for example, to the effect of, as we move forward, instead of subsidizing fossil fuels, let's look at putting that same level of funding towards northeastern BC and developing things there. And I'm sure the government is already looking at transition funding there, but actually advocating that as the rest of the province for increased levels of that. And so, the thought in my head is that gets away from, anytime there's money on the table, everyone's like, well, why not us too? We want that money, we want that money too. But as the lower mainland and other parts of BC, saying like, we're actually behind really investing in trying to find a transition. We want to kind of work through this together. We understand that northeastern BC faces particular economic risk and challenges ahead, and then we want to kind of help with that. And is that a way to, again, move forward, but also bring us together a little bit as a province?
I can tell you that one of the Vancouver Island communities always brings forward a fracking ban to each UBCM, and it fails. I think one of the things that we need to be sensitive, being in the Southwest, is trying to tell the Northeast how to build their economies. I think if you wanted to find someone in the Northeast to work with on a resolution, all the power to you. But I think it would be more powerful if it was a joint resolution versus coming from the Southwest. And that's probably, if you think about government policy, you're probably aiming at FCM. You would want that resolution to eventually go to FCM. That's where I think, and as well as the province, I guess they do subsidize oil and gas as well. So this probably is a joint approach. So you'd want it to eventually change policy at the federal and provincial. But I can only tell you the comments when that fracking ban comes forward are generally contentious. It hits north versus south, and doesn't really help our province in any way from an urban-rural divide kind of context.
And just to be clear, I wasn't thinking about proposing a fracking ban. I was thinking more in terms of advocating for greater economic transition funding for northeastern BC, for example. But maybe that's close enough that.
If you want to propose wording next week, we can certainly vote on it. I think, how would you feel if the Northeast proposed a resolution that would impact how we do business down here or our economy down here? So just reverse the scenario and assess how you would feel about that. That's my advice. I don't know, Councillor Race, you did it.
Yeah, I did, yeah. And I'm not sure how the Northeast thinks that their economy might be transitioning. But I think there was, I was just reading this morning, Vancouver Sun, that there's a report that was just completed and leaked, actually it's not really public, on fracking in the Northeast. And the gist of the report was there's not enough information, which was more or less the headline. And so it might be in everybody's interest on that particular topic to at least have better information. And maybe that's where the province can direct its resources, is to getting better information and monitoring and so forth. Because otherwise everybody is, I mean, they can see what happens, but as far as the future goes, we're to a certain extent guessing. So just personally, I wasn't going to do that, but I'll leave that to you to think about it. It was a Vancouver Sun headline, you can read that about the report.
And there may have been some resolutions that passed actually about better science around fracking that have come out of UBCM, so you might want to actually go back and see and build on those. I know you don't want it to make it specifically about fracking, but you can see the wording that at least was there.
It's the industry generally, I think, is the issue. I mean, fracking is one aspect of it, and we had a tour through it, but there's also water and other things, so, but anyway, I'll just look at that. And I don't know what that report, I'm not sure when it's supposed to be made public.
And also you've got 3 more years, so you could spend this UBCM chatting with folks up there.
Making friends.
Making friends. Great folks up there, so
Yeah.
it's well worth the conversation for sure. Okay, so I've got wording on the BC Assessment Act and possibly tax categories. Councillor Anderson, I think you're going to pursue natural resource roads research to see if you want to put that
Yes.
forward this time around.
Yes.
BCR properties,
Yes.
a mandate. Councillor French, you're going to take on the e-bike taxation issue. Councillor Stoner is going to bring forward some wording on SAR, search and rescue, sustainable funding. And I think the shift is there is that whereas the province continues to not fund this, which is a change, because I know we've brought, there have been policies before, but they have really put a line in the sand with this last budget, but they're still not taking that direction. Are there any others in this? Okay, so this document from LMLGA talks about how to write your resolution, and they've asked you to limit it to 2 whereas clauses. And in the past, the more simple you can make a resolution, the more clear you can be so that it's not open to interpretation, because as soon as communities have questions like, well, I wonder if they meant this or that, boom, there's people at the mics, and then there's people trying to amend your resolution, and then, yeah, you could lose the intent of your resolution. So go for, narrow your focus as much as possible and make your resolution very clear. You'll still see it at LMLGA and at UBCM, some that are like whereas, 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 and there's like 6 whereases, then be it resolved, and then they get to the resolution. And the problem with that is people then can start to disagree with your whereases, which then makes them think, well, then I actually disagree with this resolution. You know, the resolution might in itself be sound. So in the interest of efficiency of the conference, they ask you to limit it to 2 whereases. Be very clear about what policy or what aspect of policy you're trying to shift with your resolution. So that's clear. Whether it's provincial, whether it's federal, whether it's both, and who that body is, that's what it can be.
So just, in your opinion, taking 5 to LMLGA, is that a reasonable number? Not too many, or?
I'm not sure that after next Tuesday we'll get to all. We might not agree on all 5.
Okay.
I think last year we took 4, or the year before.
No, just
We've
questions.
taken some before. So I don't have a problem with being prolific. If we think we should change the policy. And also, if there's some that people feel would be better with the support of other communities, don't hesitate to reach out to other councillors and other communities and say, hey, I'm working on a resolution. Do you think there'd be any support in that? That's okay. Yeah. Anything?
No, but with an eye to next year, a year from now, sitting around this table, over the next year, topics that do come up or letters that do come up, we track through the minutes, the annual minutes of council say, oh, that would be good to keep in mind for resolution development. And then we just go back through the year and we search the minutes and we find them. There were none last year, but we do bring them forward and then make the mayor aware so that it comes to this table. So anytime, keep things in mind while you're going through your agenda. That's a resolution.
Just on that point, so if we had a discussion on some issue, would you want a resolution to refer it to staff for LMLGA discussion or something like that?
We've done both things, just we've had directives, we've had resolutions.
somehow we just mentioned that.
The one that comes to mind the quickest is the accidents on the highway and recovering monies for the firefighters that attend, because we currently don't. That one was just a reminder, bring that up, and we did.
Okay, so then you just drag it through the text of the minutes.
Yep.
All right, and if you just have a great idea this week, by all means, bring it forward next week, we'll vote on them, and whichever ones get, how did we do it last year, majority vote? We went to LMLGA?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And just, I don't know how LMLGA board will do it this year, but when I was on the board, we voted on whether to endorse each resolution. And if there was one director that chose not to endorse, it went to no recommendation. So the ones that, anyway, we put on the resolution agenda last time, in 2017, 2018, it was because the whole board endorsed that. As soon as there was any debate, we were like, all right, no recommendation, we'll let the body decide. And I suspect there's similar people on the board this time. It's likely that will be the way.
Sorry, just, and I can't remember if you mentioned earlier, roughly how many resolutions are typically, if there's a typical in the block, and then how many get discussed individually?
Oh gosh, I don't know. At LMLGA, we're dealing with maybe 50 or 60 resolutions, and the UBC on the book is this thick. And there's generally 3 that go as 3 different blocks. There's A resolutions, B resolutions, C resolutions. So, yeah, it can be lots. I love resolution sessions, but not everyone does.
We've got years worth of books too, if you just want to flip through just to get ideas on wording and things, and they are available on the UBCM website, the resolution books, but if you want to just take one flip through, that's not a problem either.
They even have a full database, resolution database, so you can just search.
Yeah, they do. It's amazing.
To a certain point.
There's yours on.
Well, BC Rail goes back 110 years.
Okay, wow.
Property issues since 2005.
I'm not sure we want to go back that far, Counselor. Okay, thanks you guys. That would be great if you have some resolutions going forward, and if you need any support this week, I've written a couple, but I'm no expert. But yeah, Robin, can you help if they have questions on the resolution?
Yep. And Shirley can help too.
And Shirley, yeah. All right. Thanks. Motion adjourned. Moved by Councilor Hurd, seconded by Councilor Stoner. All those in favor? Those motion carries.